Second Corinthians chapter 12, and we will cover the first 13 verses of the chapter. Now, there are two main divisions in the chapter, so we'll get the second one, obviously, next time we're together. But it's vision and then a visit. And tonight we'll look at just vision. And Paul is going to open up this chapter talking about something mysterious. Now, I love mysteries. I love reading. I love watching mysteries. Anything that has any kind of mystery to it. And then I love some of my favorite books and series are the Sherlock Holmes series and all of the mysteries in there. But I love all of those mysterious things. And then the more mysterious it is, the better. Especially if there's just no way to ever really know the final answer. It intrigues me even more. You know, I want to know even more. You know, I like all of those types of things. And Paul is going to share with us an event that happened in his life. And he's going to share some wonderful details about it. But there's a lot that he leaves out. And it's a little bit frustrating for me. But it's fascinating, and it's mysterious, and I love it. And so that's what happens in the first part, in this the first 13 verses. So let's take a look at it. Beginning at verse 1 says, "It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord." Okay, just that the word boast reminds us that Paul is in this section where he's talking about boasting. He was boasting in chapter 11. And he said that he was foolishly boasting. Boasting or bragging was not something that Paul normally liked to do. He did it because the Corinthians were receiving the false teachers, and the false teachers were bragging about how great they were. And Paul, using some sarcasm, said, "Okay, if bragging's what you like, then let me brag." And but you can almost see that he's doing it as if he's embarrassed almost. He's shy about bragging. With shy and bragging don't go together. But that's what he's been doing, and so he brings it up one more time here in verse 1. "It is doubtless, it's not profitable for me to boast." He says, "I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord." Now, he has, at one point, he compared himself with the false teachers and said, "Listen, they're this, I'm this. They're this, I'm this." And he basically was saying, we're on the same, we're on level playing ground here. We're on the level playing field. I'm no less than the false teachers is what Paul was saying. But now what he's going to do is he's going to bring up visions and revelations. And he's going to share with the Corinthians, "Listen, I've received vision. I've received revelation of the Lord." And in a sense, it's almost as if, have the false teachers received those? You almost hear him asking that. He wants the Corinthians, he's trying to get their attention, trying to snap them back into reality to say, hey, listen, Paul is saying about himself, I'm the real deal. He's not doing it in a boastful way, although again, he's boasting, he's embarrassed about it, but what he's saying is, listen, I'm the real deal. The Lord has sent me, and the Lord showed me these wonderful things. So that's what we're about to get to. In verse 2, he begins speaking in the third person, which is pretty funny, just to think about him speaking in the third person. "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a one was caught up to the third heaven." And so as he begins to speak and explain, you get the idea that he's talking about someone else. Now, I've heard of people doing this in certain athletes. My favorite soccer team, LA Galaxy, they for a while had Zlatan Ibrahimovic on their team. And Zlatan, besides being a great player throughout his career, has always been a great player, but he's also known for something else, and that is talking in the third person. And so when he's being interviewed, he will say, Zlatan thinks that Zlatan is the greatest player in the world. It's like, Zlatan, who's talking? What is he talking about? And he talks that way. Why he talks that way, I have no idea. I'm just glad that he was on Galaxy for a little while. Paul, speaking in the third person, begins to describe this incredible event. And he says that This man experienced something 14 years prior to this. And right away he gets our attention by saying this: whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know. It's a mystery what Pastor Chris has in that cup. Is it coffee? Is it water? Is it orange juice? Whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. And so right away he gets our attention. What's happening? This individual, did whatever happened, they don't know. He doesn't know if they were in the body, or did they have some sort of out-of-body experience. Oh, what was this? Was it, like an alien abduction or something? What's going on? What's happening? He goes on to tell us in verse 2, such a one was caught up to the third heaven. What is the third heaven? What does that mean? Does that mean that there are different levels of heaven? The first level is for those of us Christians who are not the greatest Christians, and we just barely get there. Second level maybe is for those, those people, they did a little bit more, went to church consistently, they did pretty good, didn't sin a whole lot, maybe they helped out a little bit at church. But third heaven, oh man, third heaven, oh man, that is for, that's for the youth leaders, that's like, oh man, they're godly, they're third heaven. Well, in fact, that's not what he's talking about. What he says when he says that this individual was caught up to the third heaven, the third heaven means heaven where God dwells. Okay? The first heaven would be what you and I look up and see. We look up and we see the sky, where birds, do their business. The second heaven would be considered space, stars, planets. Third heaven is considered to be heaven where God dwells. So we get this idea that heaven where God is it's above the sky, it's above outer space, it's above that somewhere. And Paul says that this individual, whether in the body he's not sure, whether out of the body he's not sure, but this individual was caught up to the third heaven. And it is interesting in verse 2 that the phrase there, caught up, is the same phrase that Paul uses in Thessalonians when he's talking about the rapture. And he says, we will be caught up. It's the word harpazo. And it means to be snatched away or taken by force. In other words, in Thessalonians, he's describing the Christians that they'll be caught up. It's not by their own doing or their own choice, but it's God pulling those people off of the earth. Here he says that this individual, again, this was not something that this individual did on his own, but it was the person was caught up or taken by force. Now, when I say by force, it makes it sound like the person was fighting and they were taken by force. That's not necessarily true. Just meaning that it was not their own choice or their own volition. They didn't get themselves up into the third heaven. They were taken there. And it says in verse 3, and I know such a man, Paul says, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And in verse 4, he was caught up into paradise, meaning heaven, in case we were not clear. He was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. So whoever this individual was, and again, I already kind of spilled the beans for you, this is Paul describing an event that happened in his own life, something that he experienced. Why is he talking in the third person? That's kind of weird. Well, again, he's boasting, but he's boasting foolishly. He's boasting, but he's somewhat embarrassed by it. He's not used to boasting. And so as he begins to tell this story, he's sharing it in the third person, in a sense, just slightly deflecting attention away from himself. But he tells us some pretty incredible things here in verse 4, that when this person was caught up to the third heaven, that they were caught up into paradise. That's not Hawaii. It's much better than Hawaii. Okay, you ever been to Hawaii? Incredible, beautiful, pristine beaches, jungle, mountains, everything's there. But this is going to be way better than that. way better than that. It's going to make Hawaii look like, like nothing. He was caught up into paradise, and while he was there, he heard inexpressible words. Inexpressible words. In other words, Paul says, I cannot describe to you what I heard. What did Paul hear? Now, it's funny how many Bible teachers, in going through this passage, will give you all of the different possibilities and all the different viewpoints. And we could do that, and I've got my own thoughts about this, but why? God doesn't reveal it. All he tells us is he heard inexpressible words. In other words, he heard things that he could not describe. He could not express. And he says at the end of verse 4, which it is not lawful for a man to utter. He said, I'm not even sure what I heard. And then even if I were to try to describe what I heard while I was in paradise, it would be against the law for me to do that. It would be a crime for me to describe to you or to tell you what I heard. So obviously, in describing this event, Paul was overwhelmed and not even fully understand. In fact, he started out by saying, I do not know if this person, talking about himself, I don't know if I was in my body when this happened or I was out of my body. Like, was this an out-of-body experience? I don't know. And so all of this mystery involved, and I love every bit of it. He goes on to say in verse 5, of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast. What? He's boasting about this story, about this event. Yet of myself I will not boast. Now I want you to think back to verse 1. What did Paul say he was coming to? To visions and revelations of the Lord. He wasn't writing to the Corinthians in chapter 12 to say, okay, everybody, now I'm going to give you some visions and revelations of Paul. I'm going to give you some visions and revelations about the greatness of Paul. That's not what he was doing. He told us in verse 1 what he was doing. He was going to tell us about visions and revelations of the Lord. You know the book of Revelation? By the way, it's the book of Revelation, not the book of Revelations. They're not revealing things and several things. The point of the book of Revelation is to reveal God. That's it. Now, there are lots of things that we discover in there, lots of things that we find out, lots of things from the Old Testament that we know already, and there's a lot going on there, but the whole point is to reveal God. And Paul already told us in verse 1 what he's doing here is he's not boasting about himself. Of such a one I will boast. So he's boasting about God, yet of myself I will not boast. He already told us. Verse 1. I'm going to give you visions. I'm going to tell you about visions and revelations revealing of the Lord. Of such a one I will boast. Yet of myself I will not boast except in my infirmities, my sicknesses, my weaknesses. Really? For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. But I refrain, lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. Now, we'll get to that in just a moment. But listen, I'm just going to give you my opinion real quick, my best guess as to what Paul is describing here. I think, and again, this could probably easily be blown out of the water. But I have read and I've heard of some good Bible teachers that believe this also, so I'm glad that they agree with me. I think that when Paul, again, it's my guess, that when Paul was in Lystra, okay, Acts chapter 14, Paul went into Lystra. He's preaching the gospel. Paul and Barnabas. Some Jews showed up, and they turned the crowd against Paul and Barnabas. And the Jews, because Jews were the ones that would stone people, the Jews got there, they turned the crowd against Paul and Barnabas, they grabbed Paul, stoned him, and we're told in Acts chapter 14 that they threw him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Now, my little theory on it is that the Jews, they knew how to stone people. That's what they did. That was one of the things that they did. It's gruesome, but they did it. They would stone people. And they knew how to stone people until the person was dead. So they supposing Paul to be dead. And then we're told in that story in Acts chapter 14 that Paul was left there for dead. And then it says that the believers gathered around him. And then Paul stood up and staggered back into Lystra. Boy, what is wrong with you? Have you been stoned? What is wrong with you? I think, again, it's just my little theory, I think that maybe this, what we're reading about in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I think maybe that happened. I think maybe Paul died for a short time. The believers gathered around him. I'm assuming that the believers coming around probably prayed for him, like, God, bring him back to life. And that Paul being caught up into the third heaven, and then the believers prayed for him, and he was revived and got up and staggered back into Lystra. That's just my theory. It could have happened anywhere. It could have happened, when he was blind remember he was blinded for 3 days? Or it could have been when he was in the wilderness, the desert, the Arabian desert. It could have happened anywhere. Could have happened anywhere. That's just my simple little theory on it. But this is something that Paul experienced. And he's bringing this up not to boast about himself, but to boast and brag about what God has done in and through Paul. Because he wants the Corinthians to understand, listen, I'm the real deal, guys. And there are false teachers that are trying to lead you astray. And I need you to listen to me. Verse 6, again, for though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. He says, but I refrain. I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to give any more detail. I'm not going to continue with this story. Why not, Paul? Lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. Paul says, I'm not trying to draw a bunch of attention to myself, so I'll stop with the story. It wasn't a glory story about Paul. Paul was setting out to share a vision and revelation of the Lord. Now, as is the case, and I don't think my clicker's working, so I'm going to have Leanna go ahead and click to the next slide, and right there, paradise. So we already know he went to paradise. Now I'm going to have her put the next one up, which is pain. Listen, this is a biblical principle, but it's not just a biblical principle. This is an everyday, everything, everywhere, all circumstances principle. There is nothing good that you can have without some amount of sacrifice. Do you understand what I'm saying? Some of you guys, you want to make gains. So what do you have to do? Watching motivational YouTube videos ain't going to do it. Right? You can watch them, but you got to watch them while you're pumping iron, or while you're doing push-ups, or pull-ups, or running. You've got to put in that pain in order to experience that paradise of a buff bod. You cannot get that buff bod without pain. And in working out, as you're working out and trying to get stronger, just when you get strong enough and you go, oh, this is my PR, man, I've never benched this much. Then it's time to put some more weight on. You mean more pain? Yes. It's never ending. That's why I just don't ever start. You have to sacrifice for anything that you want. You're trying to I'm going to give you a simple, silly example. You're trying to let your hair grow out? Watch out. Watch out. You're trying to let your hair grow out? What do you got to do? You got to go through that stage where your hair just looks really stupid. Man, I keep putting gel in it and it just won't do what I want. I know, because it's not to where you, right? In order to get to the end result, you got to go through that little painful process. It's not really a painful process. We feel like it is. The end of the world. I should just go get extensions. But anything that you want to accomplish, anything that good that you receive, there is going to be some sort of payment for And that is absolutely true in the Christian life. If you want to experience paradise, then there is pain that will be associated with that. In verse 7, Paul begins to describe the pain. He says, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations. In other words, I saw these incredible things. I was caught up into the third heaven. I heard words that were inexpressible. I cannot explain them to you. Things that I cannot explain. It would be against the law for me to do it. But because I received that, verse 7, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Now, here's another verse. People freak out about this. What exactly was Paul describing? What was his thorn in the flesh? Was it his eyesight? Was it his bow legs? Was it his, what was it? What was it? He tells us what it is. Listen to what he says. It's real simple. It's right here. What was given to him? A thorn in the flesh. What does that mean? Was it an actual thorn? Well, no, it probably wasn't an actual thorn, because an actual thorn, you probably can just dig that out. Okay? So he's using that phrase to describe something that was irritating. You know, when you get a thorn in your flesh, and you can't just dig it out, and you need mom to, do some surgery with the tweezers, right? But as long as it's in there, it just keeps nagging and nagging and nagging and nagging. So he's using that phrase, a thorn in the flesh, to say that it was a constant nagging. What was it, Paul? Was it your eyesight? What was it? He tells us, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. What does that mean? Well, what is a messenger of Satan? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Well, a demon. Now, does that mean that Paul was demon possessed? No. The Bible, there is never, ever, ever, don't let anybody tell you different. You can check this for yourself. There is never an instance in the Bible where a demon possessed a Christian. Christians are never possessed by demons. I don't care what that fool on YouTube told you, it is not true. Christians are not possessed by demons. There's never an instance in the Bible. Now, are there instances where demons oppressed a believer? Absolutely. But never possessed a believer. Paul here says, whatever this thorn in the flesh was, it was in the form of a messenger of Satan to, you see that word there? What is that? Buffet, right? And then I think of Shakey's, right? Bunch of lunch buffet. At the Shakey's near me, I can tell him, hey, I want a personal sized pizza, pepperoni, and cashews.
Ew.
Come on, no, you. You do not like cashews?
No, I like cashews on pizza.
Have you ever had it on pizza?
Why would you want to have?
Have you ever had it on pizza?
But, no,
Have you?
but like, why?
Okay. That's all I rest my case. Okay, I rest my case. I go in there, and then you can get, and then bunch of lunch buffet, man. You get all the mojos you want. Mojos. I'll do without the chicken, but pizza, mojos, I'm all about it. So what is Paul saying here? A messenger of Satan brought a buffet to him. Oh, that sounds really good. Except it's not the word buffet. A messenger of Satan to buffet me. The word buffet means to punch. That's what it means. What Paul is saying here is that in order to keep him humble after receiving this incredible revelation of being caught up into the third heaven, he says, to even me out, to keep me humble, I received a thorn in the flesh, something irritating, something that was pestering me, bugging me, and it was in the form of a messenger of Satan punching me. Now, what exactly does that mean? Great question. I do not know. But what I do know is enough. And what it says here is that there was some sort of satanic attack on Paul. Okay? And he tells us why that was in verse 7, lest I be exalted above measure. It's to keep him humble. Now, I want you to see what Paul does here, and I'm going to ask for Leanna's help again. Could you please put the next, there it is. Here's the first thing that he did, was he voiced his concern about this. In verse 8, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. 3 times Paul prayed that he would escape it. When Paul voiced it, his concern, what he did was he prayed that he could escape this problem. That's me. As soon as something bad goes wrong, I immediately Lord, please take this away in Jesus' name. Now we're going to see things change and turn here, but I think most of us, that's where we go to. We don't normally go, oh Lord, I just love this. Give me more pain. We don't do that. First thing we say is, Lord, take it away. So he prayed 3 times. I also like that Paul prayed 3 times. 3 times. Do sometimes people put a trip on you like, oh, how many times are you going to pray for that? I mean, you prayed once already. Don't you have faith? Paul says, man, I prayed 3 times. I wanted this thing gone. And this is Paul the apostle. This is the guy who was caught up in the 3rd heaven. This is the guy who spent his life serving the Lord. And I mean, I think if anybody deserves to be freed from pain, I feel like Paul would be the one that would deserve that, right? I mean, he was basically stoned to death at Lystra. He's been beat, he's been shipwrecked, he's been in the ocean, he's been whipped, all kinds of craziness. And then he asks God, please take away the pain, and God says, nah. What? Here's the next thing that he did. He voiced it, and then look what he did. He viewed it, if we can get that up there, please. Verse 9, and he said to me, this is what God said, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, God said no. Instead, my grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. God says, my strength is made perfect in you in your weakness. And then Paul says, therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. When Paul voiced what was going on, he was praying and asking for escape. But now his viewpoint has changed. Did you notice that? He went from voicing it to viewing it, and he views it differently. He says, okay, now it's not about escaping it, it's about enduring it. Verse 9, therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. But here's the third thing that he did in verse 10. Therefore, I take pleasure in weaknesses, in reproaches, that's being hated, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The third thing that Paul did, he voiced it, he viewed it, and then he valued it. And he said, wait a minute. If in exchange for this pain, I get God's grace, it's got some value. He says, I take pleasure in it. What he did at that point, the first time when he voiced it, what he was doing was he was asking for an escape. When he began to view it differently, he said, okay, I'm going to endure. And when he valued it, this pain, he was enlisting that pain. He says, okay, this is a good thing. I can use this for God's glory. When I'm weak, then I'm strong. Listen, family, you and I are experiencing pain, or we are going to experience pain. It's just a fact of life, period. Everybody is, Christian or not Christian. What changes us from victim to victor? What changes us, you and I, from victim to victor is to handle that pain the way that Paul did. It's okay to voice it. God, please take it away. But when God says no, I'll give you my grace instead, that should change our viewpoint. Then we view it differently. And we say, oh, wait a minute. I'll gladly boast in my weaknesses. And then what we're able to do is to take that pain and value it, enlist it, and say, okay, this can be used for God's glory. This can be used for God's glory. That, handling it that way, the voicing it, the viewing it, the valuing it, changes me from a victim to a victor. From being a victim to being victorious. We need that. I told you a couple of weeks ago that you and I right now, man, we're riding a wave together. This is a really good time in youth ministry here at Revival. We've got people, many of you are excited from what happened at camp. Many of us came back, immediately we went into Mexico mission mode. We spent all of Friday afternoon and all of Sunday together. And we're thinking, mission Mexico. And then there are many of us who, after that, we're thinking, oh, summer camp. And then we're thinking, mission trip to Nicaragua. We're going through a very, very good time right now. Family, we cannot have the paradise without the pain. And I have this sense, I believe that God is putting this on my heart. I told you this, I think it was last week. He began to impress this on my heart that you and I together are going to experience the pain that accompanies the paradise. How will you and I handle that together? Will we turn on one another? Become cannibalistic like so many Christians do and begin to eat each other up alive? Or are we together going to say, you know what? Let's take it to the Lord. Let's voice it. And the pain, let's view it in a different way. Maybe this is a good thing. And then will we value it and say, no, this is a good thing. Because pain, I have noticed, and you may have noticed, does one of two things in people. It either splits them apart or it makes the bond stronger. What I'm hoping for you and I is that as you and I experience pain together, that you and I will grow stronger. If we will commit ourselves to this, we'll grow stronger through it. Paul finishes, or will finish actually, in verses 11 through 13. He says, I have become a fool in boasting. You have compelled me. For I ought to have been commended by you. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing, Paul says. He says, listen, you guys should have accepted me. You didn't. I'm not lacking in anything. I'm not behind these most eminent apostles. He's referring to the false teachers, the false apostles. He says, even though I'm nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. He says, you saw it all for yourselves when we were there. And finally in verse 13, for what is it in which you were inferior to other churches, except that I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. Again, he's being sarcastic. He's saying, the false teachers were a burden to you. And he says, I'm sorry that we weren't burdensome to you. He didn't really want to be burdensome to the Corinthians. He's being sarcastic. He's trying to get them to understand we weren't a burden to you. And that was the right way to conduct ourselves.